when we think about Japan and China in relation to the world wars, we always think about the Second World War, Sino-Japanese War, Pacific War, leading to millions of deaths, both in Japan and in China. And World War I is often sort of a footnote or forgotten. But I'm going to focus today on the impact and legacy of World War I on Japan. And was it really a failure? And what are, for who, and from whose perspective? For Japan, it really was an arrival and part of a continuing sort of struggle to gain status as a world power. So they joined the Big Five at Versailles along with the US, Britain, France, and Italy. And the reason why they're able to do that is they participate in the occupation of German territories in China, in Shandong in North China, as well as taking over German territories in the South Pacific, what we now know today as Micronesia. So having been inflicted unequal treaties by the Western powers and tariff restrictions, they had been able to, the Japanese had been able to revise these treaties really only a couple decades prior to the World War I. And so in 1919 in Versailles, when they proposed a racial equality clause to be respected as an equal nation or equal race to the Western nations, this is part of their efforts to promote the idea that Japan is at least an honorary Western power. Right? They had been experiencing anti-immigration laws in California, Canada, the British Dominions in Australia and New Zealand, and then in California you have alien land laws in the 1910s as well. So a lot of it is about saving face and trying to make the League acceptable to the Japanese public. And in fact, this racial equality clause, when it was voted on by the League committee in April 1919, 7 out of the 11 powers, including China, which is protesting Japanese imperialism in China, they approve this racial equality clause, but Wilson rejects it because on the claim that he needed a unanimous vote. So what's the legacy? Japan loses out on including a racial equality clause, but in many ways they can point to 1919 in the 1920s and 30s as they further expand into China and then later in Southeast Asia of how the US and Western powers are very hypocritical in their moral principles and international relations, and it becomes fuel for this pan-Asian order that Japan needs to liberate the rest of Asia from Western dominance, and that they can point to 1919 to show sort of how the League of Nations was founded on just principles. So Japan leaves World War I in Versailles, having taken over German territories in China and then in the South Pacific. And so in many ways, their status as a real imperial power is recognized by their Western allies. Now for China, like Japan, they had joined the Allied powers later in 1917 by sending Chinese laborers to the French war front, roughly 140,000. And this allows China to join the post-war conference, though as a minor nation, not one of the big five like Japan. And it's forgotten that China, despite its growing tensions with Japan, actually supports and votes for the racial equality clause because part of China's goals in 1919 is to fight against this Western-centric international order. You have the Russians, the French, the Germans, the Americans, and the British with spheres of influences and basically imperial interests in China that they're trying to eliminate. They quickly realize this is not possible, so they focus on Japan's 21 demands, which led to what we call the May 4th movement in 1919. Basically, the 21 demands aimed at expanding Japanese imperial interests, not just in Shandong, the former German territory, but in northeast China, in central China, Shanghai, and South China. And World War I really is a turning point in terms of the rise of Japanese interests in China, the decline, obviously elimination of German territories, but even the decline of British and French vis-a-vis Japanese power. Yet there's disillusion and protest because in the end, they feel betrayed by Wilson and the Western powers for granting Shandong province to Japan. And really, it sort of results in this idea of, recognizing the weakness of China's international status. There is a symbolic protest in that the Chinese representatives refused to sign the treaty. And so in Chinese textbooks, even to this day, people point to 1919 as sort of the awakening and rise of Chinese nationalism. Now, much of the focus, deservedly, is towards Japanese imperialism, 1919 being the start of Japanese expansion, not just in Taiwan and Manchuria, but other parts of China, which leads to Japanese incursions in Manchuria in 1931, and then the invasion and total war in 1937. But it's not just anti-imperial and anti-Japanese sentiment that perhaps is of use to current Chinese nationalism, right? Because when we talk about international relations and morality, the Chinese will point to 1919 about how Wilsonian rhetoric and the reality of racial equality or self-determination really didn't come about in the case of China and in Korea.